Hey gang, we are back at Rosehill Cemetery with Britain, and we are going to be telling actually a part two. This is the vampire story. We were out here during a previous episode, just under a year ago, at this section by the Mary Shedden grave, and Britain was telling us the story of a vampire that was back from the 1800s. Now what you want to do is we will put the link in the description box of that episode. It's at about the minute 30 mark. Well, the minute 30 mark you want to hit if you want to skip to it. Here's the short version of what we found, or what we were actually talking about, because when I say what we found, we did find it, and I've got to give Britain credit, and we've got to give Deb a bunch of credit, which really started with, we came back here, Britain was working with Deb, our ancestry helper, on, we're trying to find out who was the woman that was the vampire, the thought to be vampire that they exhumed from this location. Who was she? We wanted to find her grave, and again, as I said, Britain and Deb put it together. Well, started to put it together because Deb found this book on the doctor, and Britain's going to talk about it, and it was his testimony of this event that happened here. And going through the book, Britain and I then came out here. We probably spent, an hour and a half walking?
At least, walking in circles right here.
And we were looking for the date between 1874 and 1876, something like that. And we couldn't put it backwards, but Mr. Britain didn't give up. He came back here on his own, and his wheels were turning, and with some famous names that he already knows, like the Pratts and the Lunts, he found it. So we're gonna go walk to that grave. Actually, Britain, tell us a little bit of the story. We have the Great Chicago Fire, the Old City Cemetery. This is where she was originally buried. Many of those people, including, what was her name?
Henrietta Lunt Young.
Yeah, her maiden name was Lunt, a very famous family here. So they moved them from the city cemetery, the Old City Cemetery. This is when they kind of started Rosehill, right?
Yeah.
So take the story from there.
Okay, the connections actually go all the way back to Fort Dearborn. Now, once again, from me to you, Deb, thanks so much. This book that she cued us into was a Victorian-era book on the occult and demonology, and it was literally a couple paragraphs of an excerpt that kind of blew this all up and gave me something really steady to go upon. But this goes all the way back to Fort Dearborn, and a gentleman named Dr. Dyer, who, if you watch the first one, I kind of go and ramble off about Dr. Dyer, how incredible he was. Great pioneer, abolitionist, a great physician, great doctor. Back to Fort Dearborn, Dr. Dyer was the head surgeon at Fort Dearborn. From there, he gets connected to the Lunt family, a gentleman by the name of Orrington Lunt and his wife Cornelia. Cornelia Lunt was the head of the Daughters of the Revolution at Fort Dearborn. She also was an accountant. She also worked for a grain commerce connection that they had where the settlers were getting food. Orrington Lunt was actually a grain commissioner. He was a grain and commerce commissioner, and that was his business. Orrington Lunt is most famous for being the founder of Northwestern University, honestly. He was the founder of Northwestern, the connection to Dr. Dyer, the Lunts, personal physician, personal doctor, all throughout their later years up until the end of Dr. Dyer's life. But basically, Dr. Dyer was the family's physician for all the Lunts, starting with Cornelia and Orrington, going all the way back to Fort Dearborn.
So how did all this, the woman died?
Yeah.
Young?
Huh?
Her name was Young, but she died kind of young.
She died young, and there was actually a tuberculosis breakout through the whole family.
There you go.
Almost everybody in the family got stricken with TB between 1873 and 1874. You had a lot of tragedies and misfortunes that kind of follow and swirl around them at this time.
Well, let's walk to her grave, and let's continue to tell the story. of what happened. Now, she must have been one of the people of the family, one of the family members that died early, because of course the way this whole thing works is, you know, in those days, and we've gone to New England, we've told the story of the vampires, the ransom and all that, is the TB with the tuberculosis. You would have the blood coming out of the nose, you'd have all these symptoms, and back in those days they thought that their loved ones that had passed on had turned into a vampire because other family members were getting TB, afflicted, and then they would think they're coming from the grave, and we've got to dig them up, right?
Yeah. You were basically sleeping in the same room or cabin, the illness would spread. Now, to get back to the origins of this all, that there is the Mary Shedden grave, where we had our first clue, where I had first heard about this in the late 90s from a woman named Helen Sclair, who was known as the cemetery lady, Miss Helen, rest in peace.
She was so famous here.
She sure was. And a lot of her stories were very much fact, very much passed down from generation to generation.
And you actually met her.
Sure. She lived at Bohemia National, but she would always be out here feeding the geese over by Section 18 where my family's at. But just to kind of give a nod off to Mary Shedden, Helen always told me that the grave of this, the exorcism / vampire case was always right here in this vicinity. In fact, Helen's words to me were, it's one of the older graves that is right behind Mary Shedden. And we all know the legend about this one. You can see a face supposedly inside of this.
Yeah, the face in the granite. Mm-hmm. The skull.
Yeah.
It said that if either her face will appear or a skull face will appear. But again, this is the landmark. You can watch that in the prior episode, but this is the landmark that we kind of used in this section to search. We searched all over every single grave here, but it was right under our nose, right?
Yeah. And I have yet to show him exactly where it is.
Yeah, I have not seen it yet. So this is exciting for me also.
Wentworth's secretary. Now this area we are in is famously known. Almost all of these families here were into private business, private merchants, but they were all the founders of the Chicago Board of Trade. Lo and behold, my friend.
She's right here, huh?
Yeah.
Let me spin around this way. L.B. Young. So now, there it is, Etta L. Young, right?
Yes.
Gosh, how did we miss this?
That was the body that was exhumed
there
in
it is,
1875.
1874.
By Dr. Dyer.
So in 1875,
yeah,
this
Dr. Dyer came out with her uncle, Orrington Lunt, and her father, W. Lunt, I believe his name was William, as well as her husband's family. The Lunts got the Youngs involved into the grain and commerce industry as well, and they kind of took it over a few years later, going into the 20th century, early 1900s. The Youngs kind of took over the helms of the grain and commerce that the Lunts had originally started, going all the way back to Fort Dearborn. But Miss Henrietta L. Young, and now there is not too much you can dig in. There is just such a weird way that the family tree and the stories and the legacies go on, but somehow this chapter with her, it just kind of dries up.
But what we do know is that right here, literally on the ground we're standing on, she is here. They exhumed her a year later, and they took organs out. What did they?
Took her heart out and burned it.
Did they say where they burned it?
No.
They just just her heart.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, they cut her heart out and burned it. Right here in the vicinity, you have 6 of them. A little more evidence here too that kind of points to this. On the other side, like I had mentioned, 73, 74, they all got sick. You have a baby who, you have a nephew, I believe, had passed away.
George Robb Lunt. And that is 1874. And you know what? That is a great find, Britton.
Yeah.
Because you can just imagine the baby died of they probably thought it's Henrietta. She's a vampiress. She killed the baby, right?
Yep.
Wow.
They all got sick. Susan here was already passed away by the mid-70s, but
Yeah.
pretty much everybody else on here got sick and was battling life and death with TB at that time. And Dr. Dyer had, Dr. Dyer, there still is no cure for it, honestly. And Dr. Dyer could only do what he could do. It was by the
Well,
by the
there is a
recommendation.
vaccine. There is now. I think it was near World War II. We talked about that. Whatever the date was, they got TB under control. But this is. I love that you found this the baby here, because that's 1874.
Yeah.
Now again, we don't have what. There's no date during that year, and going back to Henrietta, there's no. Do we have through the records who died when, like the exact dates?
No.
So
I'm
maybe
sure we can dig in though. And I actually contacted a descendant, a fourth generation descendant, one of the Youngs, Mr. Marcus Young. Thank you, Marcus, if you're out there watching this. You were the pivotal piece that
Well,
tied it
I
all
will
together.
bet you that Henrietta died probably in between January, February, March, probably earlier in the year or mid-year, and that the baby died. Yeah, I'm speculating, but the baby died right after that, and that's probably what. And they're all getting sick.
Yeah.
Wow,
The
what a
age
great
ties into
story!
the story. She was either 30 or 31 years old, young, beautiful wife, stricken down, and a bunch of bad luck followed. So they were
All right.
their superstitions, which were very popular at that time. If you had the money and you were able to get a doctor or go this route, the whole vampire craze was just going nuts, spreading from the East Coast all the way here to Chicago. Get this out of the way
Well,
and set this down here.
let's set that flower.
Henrietta. Oh, young. Rest in peace, Henrietta. You are not forgotten.
Henrietta Young and the rest of the Lunt family and the Young family. So that's it. Britain solved the riddle. Great team. Thank you again, Deb. And there's your vampire story for Halloween week 2022. We'll see you guys on the next one.